Did you know that in the US, subsidies reduced the price of oil by around $6.24 per barrel? Although this leads to an increase, although this leads to a reduction in how much oil it is for us to purchase, how much it is for us to purchase oil here in the States, it also increases the consumption of oil by around $374 billion of gas per year. This dramatically increases our global carbon footprint, as we are one of the largest oil importers and exporters in the world. It may seem good for us who consume oil, but according to a 2021 article by the Environmental Letters Reservation, these large consumptions of oil actually go to hurt our planet by a lot, as the environment suffers due to the amount of carbon in the air, along with the degradation of our ozone layer. And so that is why I'm trying to argue that is why I am for an end in federal subsidies for fossil fuel companies. And to do this, we have to get into the root of why this is an issue in the first place, which is that the state subsidies, the state tries to sabotage its own climate goals when funding these fossil fuel companies. In a 2025 article by the Global Change Biology Association, we see that fossil fuel subsidies broke an all-time high in 2020. As fuel costs were artificially inflated, we needed to generate even more money to match biofuels, as fossil fuel prices rose due to subsidies artificially inflating prices. This led to an increase in the global market for fossil fuel, which led to even higher consumption than we're usually used to. And we see in a 2021 article by Nature in London, that the government although the governments say they want green initiatives, their investments usually say otherwise, as the impacts on air pollution and global warming are higher than they have ever been. And politicians do not pay the price for these issues with oil consumption. And what was the cause of this in the first place? And I would say the cause of this is how profitable the subsidies are for the companies and for the government. We see in a 2021 article by the SNL Energy Power Daily that in 2020 they netted around $8.96 billion in taxpayer funds for subsidies, and the largest share of this went to the oil sector. And majority of these investments are on our local gas companies we know today, and they make a lot of money off of this, and majority of this goes straight back to the US, and so this creates an extremely high profit margin for the US. We see that the politicians see these companies, and they don't want to give up legislation. Although they may advocate for environmental policy, they continue to invest subsidies into these fossil fuel companies just because it boosts their economy, making it easier for us to purchase things in the US, but we often don't think about the overall harm this does cause to the environment. And so I wanted to get into the main issue, and so we look into what are potential solutions for this problem. From what I saw, because the issue is that this causes irreparable harm to the environment. There are many and it causes many problems along with carbon impact. That our best bet is putting limits on how much funds that these fossil fuel companies get, and so that they can't produce and get as much oil. And so in a 2023 article by the Congressional Documents and Publication Bureau, we see there's a published a published bill in 2023 by the Joe Biden administration known as the End Oil and Government Tax Subsidies Act. In this act, we see that they're arguing for a tax cut on all government initiative on. They're ordering for a tax cut on all government subsidies for these fossil fuel companies, or the removal of the tax cut. And so companies will have so the government and these companies have a less incentive to work together and put so much money into it, as majority of it would be taxed. And although this bill was put on hold, we see in another article from the same publication in 2025 that this bill was reintroduced into legislation, but another policy was introduced to this bill, and that was that there would also be a limit on fossil fuel expansion, and so there wouldn't be as much fossil fuel pumping stations around the U.S., and the land that they could use would be limited. Through this, there's also two other bills that were introduced that we see in a 2025 article by the Federal Info and News discussions. And these two bills were the LNG public interest, the LNG public interest bill, and the Exported Carbon Emission Act. In the LNG public interest bill, we see that there would be a publication on the impacts of CO2 emissions. That impacts on the CO2 emissions would be weighed in when evaluating for a company's eligibility to get their license, their energy license. And so basically companies would be first evaluated to see whether they are able to be licensed, and there would be proper regulation on these companies. And for the carbon emission and the Export Carbon Emission Act, they make a policy where every 10 years these companies would be required to publish a summary of all things they've done emission wise for their companies. So everything like their mining and the fossil fuels, all the regulation has to be posted every 10 years. And through all this, we hope to make proper regulation for these companies. I think this is one of the best ways we can combat fossil fuel. Although these things do help combat fossil fuel subsidies, I think that there needs to be a lot more action taken by the government, as we see these policies only help with regulation, but the main issue is that they're still happening, they're still spreading.